Now, tonight we're here to discuss something that has become truly existential. It's an existential issue, how our consumer culture is destroying the planet. But I think that even more importantly, we're here to talk about why the story of endless growth has been the dominant story of our time, and why a life defined by what we buy and how much of it we buy leaves us empty of purpose and meaning. So the discussion tonight will focus on this new book by Michael Harris. It's called All We Want. It's fantastic. I encourage you all to go and get a copy for yourselves. You can also get a copy from the library. And in this book, Michael shares some ideas on how we can write new stories about who we are as a species to help us break this curse of consumerism. So I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Anjali, Michael, can you please join me on stage? Hello, nice to see you.
Hi.
Michael Harris is a writer based here in Vancouver. His first book, The End of Absence, won the Governor General's Literary Award for nonfiction, and it was a national bestseller. His second book, Solitude, was also a national bestseller. And his writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the Globe and Mail, the Washington Post, Time, The Walrus, Wired, Salon, etc., etc. Great to have you here, Michael. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. And Anjali Appadurai is a climate justice activist, communicator, and artist of South Indian descent. Now, she works as a climate justice lead at the Sierra Club, BC, and an organizer with the newly formed Climate Emergency Unit. She also recently formed the Padma Center for Climate Justice, which is an organization that will provide a space for young people from global South diasporas to come together around issues of climate change, globalization, and equity. So what we're going to do now, thank you so much for joining us, Anjali, as well.
So happy to be here.
What we're going to do now is we're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they're going to take questions for the audience, from the audience. So for you, the audience, I want to ask you a quick favor. Please use the Q&A button on Zoom to submit your questions instead of using the chat. It just makes it easier for us to manage your questions, and then they won't get buried in the chat. But I understand some of you don't like the Q&A button, and that's okay. So if you do put things in the chat, we'll manage, don't worry about it. But if you can, please use the Q&A button. On that note, let's please keep the chat civil and respectful. So without further ado, please, Anjali, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this much anticipated conversation. I'm so excited to be chatting with Michael today. I have been on quite a journey with this book over the past week. So Michael, thank you for that. And yeah, and I'm really excited to sort of dig into some of the themes here. I've been a climate activist and a communicator, digging into these issues for over a decade now. And I got my start in international climate politics following the UN climate process, which has been a very stalled political deadlock for many years. And so I've had my head in climate policy, international and federal and local, for a number of years now. And so I've sort of seen this issue from many sides, because I've also been an activist on the ground supporting social movements. But this book was a different kind of climate book. And so, Michael, I would love for you to start off telling everyone why you wrote it, where you started with this journey, because you didn't actually, from what I understand, come at it from wanting to write a climate book, right?
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, I think writing a book is a long journey, even though this is a fairly short book, and where it ends up is often not where it begins. Or you start off with a kind of like a discomfort, I think, that makes you want to go down on this journey. And for me, it was actually, it kind of began with a bitterness about what my friends and I thought we were supposed to have and what we ended up actually having. I think in North America, anyhow, we're sort of the first generation in modern history to have smaller expectations than our parents had. So that story of up that we kind of that we're enmeshed in our consumer culture wasn't panning out for me and my friends. And so it started off with me just wanting to write this book about like, why didn't I get what I thought I was supposed to get, you know? And it was only after like maybe 6 months of research. It takes me a little while to figure these things out sometimes, but it took me about that long to figure out it wasn't about me not getting what I wanted. It was going to be a book about why do we all want these things and how totally untenable that fantasy of consumer culture really is.
Wow, that's quite a deep dive. And I understand you grew up in Vancouver, right?
Yeah. I grew up over on the North Shore, and very comfortable sort of upbringing. Very middle class. So that's another thing. This book is as much as it is something for all of us to be thinking about everywhere on the planet. It's coming from my perspective as a North American, as a white guy, as somebody who grew up fairly comfortable. So I think that's important to keep in mind, just like for the rest of the conversation too, right? That this is a story, a truth about how we handle consumer culture, but there are a million different ways to think about this and to proceed.
That's thank you so much for situating us.
Yeah.
As we start talking about the book, I mean, it's so important when we talk about climate change, whenever we're using the big word we and us, to situate ourselves in that conversation, because this issue is such a deeply complex one that's fundamentally at its core about injustice, right? I mean, different people have very, very, very different experiences of this crisis. And so I think it's so important for us to write stories for our cohorts, for our people. And you mentioned in our earlier conversation, I mean, your sort of cohort that you mentioned, you're growing up in North America, you're middle class, you're white, that is a particular story that you grew up in that's being exported to the rest of the world, right?
Totally. So, that vision, that like dream of the 20th century in North America, which is kind of like running aground on the realities of the 21st century. People in developing countries all over the world are entering that consumer story now, right? It's expected that 3 billion more people are going to enter the middle class over the next several decades globally. So what does that mean to enter the middle class? It means you have a little bit of extra money to spend on something other than just basic survival, right? So 3 billion more middle class people is 3 billion more consumers, right? They're going to be coming into this journey too. So obviously, like the way that everybody deals with confronting the kind of that untenable nature of consumer culture is going to be different in different cultures and in different families, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting that a larger and larger portion of the planet is having to come up with some kind of solution or revolution of their own, because that what we're discovering is that the story of consumer culture only works for a century or two before what it comes down to is you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, right? Totally. You run into an arithmetic problem.
Exactly. And that's why the message of the book is so salient. It's almost like a warning to this sort of burgeoning middle class around the world. And as an immigrant, I can really speak to that, that story of consumption, and that story of the good life that is attained through consumption is something that's so deeply held. It's what drives our families to seek the West, for better or worse, and it's the fundamental deadlock actually at the global negotiations. We've created a model of growth that depends upon emissions, and we've created it built on the story that growth is good, and of course it has worked out for the rich countries of the world, right? It's really worked out for us here in North America. It's worked out well for Europe. It's worked well for the global North. And so now there's this fundamental issue of like,
and it is raising poorer countries out of poverty in a lot of ways, right? It's not that consumption or capitalism is something to be completely destroyed. What I think happens is it becomes a monomyth. It becomes the only story, right? I mean, every culture has had some kind of trade. We're always going to have some sort of economics at play in our lives. The problem is when it becomes the driving way that you measure your life. It becomes the only way you have to create a sense of purpose in your days.
Right. And so for the economies that have gone through that process, there's this sense, globally that, well, isn't it unfair to kick away the ladder for the rest of the world?
Exactly. And it's two ideas at the same time, right? That for some, yes, actually growth is necessary to emerge out of poverty, while the rich of the world actually need to begin this process of degrowth. So to have both those things going on at the same time is, I mean, the only way to do that is to not have a dogma around growth being good, and instead having humanity being good, right? That this is about creating healthy lives, not about just infinite growth.
Yeah, and I guess that's where our story begins. So it's those at the top have had the story work for their parents, people like you, for example, and it's those at the top where we really need to start living in a different way. And this book traces the story. Well, first it exposes the story. You really expose how we're living in this story in a way that there's nothing neutral about it. It's, you've traced it to its mechanics. You've traced how it's a story that's been meticulously crafted. You've illustrated who it's been crafted by. And it shows us that there are so many assumptions and intentional choices, policy choices and economic choices behind this culture that we take for granted. So tell us about that.
I mean, so I'm a huge fan of Joan Didion. She talks about how we tell ourselves stories in order to live, right? That we are storytelling creatures. And I mean, this is something Yuval Noah Harari talks about a lot too, right? That our countries, our economies, these are narratives, these are fairy tales that we tell ourselves. That doesn't mean that they are not real. They are having very real effects on our lives, obviously. But the stock market is not real the way that the planet is real, right?
Right. It's just
the stock market is a tale, and America is a tale. Canada is a tale. Stories matter. You have to have respect for stories, but they are also being shaped and invented by people who have intentions. So, I mean, one of the chapters in the book looks at sort of the beginning of the consumer culture as we know it today. Starting, I mean, basically, if you start with like the Industrial Revolution, you've got suddenly the ability to create more things than we really need. And the people who are creating all of that have to then invent desire so that we will buy those things from them, right? So suddenly you see in like the 1910s, 1920s, the propagandists that were being employed by actually governments and by militaries start to be employed by cigarette companies and other corporate powers, right? So I focus on a guy called Edward Bernays.
Yeah.
Who, he gets hired by American Tobacco, who's like, the people at American Tobacco have discovered that women aren't smoking their share of cigarettes because there is a kind of taboo against women smoking in public. And so Edward Bernays is like, okay, the way he was Freud's nephew. So he had all these, ideas about the deep, dark human psyche kind of built into him, right? And he decided he was going to pair not just utility with the product, but a sense of identity with the product. That this thing that you're going to buy, this is going to make you into the person you want to be. It's not just something you need, It is who you are. And so what he starts doing, he basically invents like the influencer, the Instagram influencer, right? In like the 1920s, he gets a bunch of debutantes in New York, like kind of model-y, pretty women, and convinces them through like an intermediary to stand up for women's rights by smoking on Fifth Avenue and marching down the streets of New York. Without them knowing, he goes and gets a bunch of journalists to come and photograph them. And then he whispers in the journalists' ears, you know, those aren't cigarettes they're smoking. Those are torches of liberty. Wow. And right, which is kind of like the Statue of Liberty, Torch of Liberty, right? Yeah. So perfect. And like basically within the year, he does a bunch of other stunts also, but he basically convinces American women that to smoke is to be a free woman, right? And you can see this in like flapper culture that came out, like the jazz era, right? That long cigarette, right? Like it was sexy. It was like that was a woman who was liberated, was one who smoked, right? And American Tobacco, which they owned Lucky Strike cigarettes, right? So they were ready with a female-centric advertising campaign. Anyway, long story, but the point is like something happens shortly after the Industrial Revolution where ad men start becoming the engines of economy.
What really struck me about that story, I mean, several things. That was a really fascinating case study. But, you know, American Tobacco so carefully manufactured this. I mean, and then you take the story even further. It was like women didn't like the color of the packaging.
Yeah,
but then
it was
the
wrong
guy didn't
green.
want to change the color. So instead, he got the ad guy to turn the color green, which was the color that women didn't like, into the Vogue color of the year, and manufactured this whole thing. So what really surprised me about that, it was that the company managed to completely keep its footprint out of it, even though it was manipulating so much.
Yes.
And I think that's
this is true. Story. You know, I mean, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not, but ad men to this day are still doing that unconsciously. Our taste is being manipulated nonstop, right? Like, and that's really the goal behind influencers, right? When on Instagram, Nike doesn't want to tell you buy these shoes. They want somebody who you think of as an authentic person to tell you to buy those shoes. They want to place those shoes on an athlete. It's always about becoming the person you want to be, not buying the thing.
Right. And then all the values that you look up to, all the values that that athlete represents to you suddenly get tied to that product.
Exactly.
But that story is really cool because it illustrates that there are architects of the stories that we're living in at all times.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, an even earlier chapter in the book is looking at dopamine and the way that, you know, like we are to a degree designed to consume, because an animal with a lot of dopamine is going to gather resources, right? And that's going to be a successful animal. The problem is that culture evolves and technology evolves so much faster than our biology evolves, right? So our dopamine system gets hijacked by ad men and by the culture at large.
Right. And similarly, the way that there are architects to that story hijacking parts of our psyche and parts of our nature, I mean, on the broadest level as well, the climate crisis, which to some, you know, seems like just a natural set of, you know, weather events, is also carefully crafted set of circumstances. But we'll come back to that at the end. I want to get to that. I mean, so the journey of this book was really interesting, and I'd love for you to speak to the arc of it, because you know, you start reading the book and it's starting with the stories that we're talking about right now, you know, really dissecting the mechanics of the consumer culture story and who created it and how, and the dopamine in the brain. And so really historical data and facts and stats. And then the book slowly goes into this very personal territory, a very tender territory at the end. It becomes very personal to you and your family.
Yeah.
Was that intentional? And what does that speak to?
Yeah. So about halfway through the book, the story of consumer culture has been, as you say, kind of dissected and exposed as a narrative. and I start to ask, okay, if that narrative is so untenable, what are the other narratives? And I kind of focus on Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia, this idea that a happy or fulfilled person is not somebody that's just gathering objects of power, but is somebody who is thriving by being themselves at their utmost, right? So it's not about getting something, it's about being something. So I started looking for what are these other narratives by which we can measure our lives. And so I write about craft, I write about the sublime, and I write about taking care of people. And so those alternate stories, alternates to the consumer culture, become where the book goes. And to kind of reflect on this idea of like focusing on our humanity as opposed to our houses and our things. The book's shape and style actually transforms as you proceed. So as you're saying, it starts off like a fairly straightforward kind of nonfiction book, and then it becomes increasingly intimate as it goes on, to the point where by the end, you almost don't even realize you're reading a book about consumer culture, because what you've ended up reading is actually a book about what life could be like if we weren't nearly so interested in our things and started becoming more interested in each other.
Right. The final chapter is it's a really beautiful account of care happening in your family from one person to another. I don't want to spoil the book, but it really goes into the details of care and what it looks like to derive value and to derive meaning from giving. I mean, you talk about the reciprocity of giving and how it gives you so much to give.
Yeah, I think, the thing consumer culture tells us that life is about becoming happy. Buy this and then you'll be happy.
Yeah.
Right? And care, I don't think it's about being happy. I think if your life is just about being pleased all the time, that's actually, I think that's an impoverished state of being. Wow. Sometimes it's about sacrifice. Sometimes it's about taking care of other people. And anybody who has like a parent with Alzheimer's or, somebody with a drug addiction that they take care of, if they know that it's not just about being happy. Sometimes it's about being in a really dark space. And that I don't think that should be shied away from. I think that's part of our fuller humanity as well.
Right. And so you're saying in this book that by sort of fleshing out those parts of ourselves and witnessing them and allowing them to flourish, we can begin to change the story that we're living through.
Exactly. And we start, hopefully we become like in microcosm the kind of country or the kind of planet that we want, that isn't measuring everything by GDP, but is starting to measure things in other ways.
Right. There's two things I want to dig into here. This assumption of GDP as or endless growth as the default, and that's a really interesting thing, because the book, I mean, it's soft at the end, but there's a hard edge to it, in that you're saying that there's this nexus between policy and stories, and they shape each other. Like this consumer culture story is shaping policy choices that seem to be default, but they're not. You're kind of exposing that they're based on a story, the story of endless growth. So, can you kind of speak to that assumption of GDP as the number one measure?
I mean, I think some people might be surprised to realize that GDP is itself a kind of an invention, right?
Right.
A national accounting of a country's economics, of everything that is sold or produced in a given year, that is not something that was around in the 19th century, 18th century, or 19th century maybe, but it's part and parcel with our consumer culture, that idea of measuring the success of a country by the gross domestic product, right? And we're beginning to see in countries like New Zealand that there are alternate measurements, right? That there are quality of life indexes that are starting to be used, or that could be used as an alternative. Even, I'm going to forget his name, but the guy who first brought to the American Congress the idea of a set of accounting of what the country had produced. Even he, when he brought that forward, which later became GDP, he told them, of course, no one would ever want to take this as the only measure. You have to always ask, growth of what and growth for what, right? I mean, you can increase a country's GDP by going to war. That doesn't mean that we want to just keep on going to war, right? It's a factor, a lever, and it's clearly not the only one, but we pretend it's the only one. And my hope is that enough people start to vote for politicians that are going to, be putting things other than GDP at the front of the list.
What a thought. But this is interesting because it speaks to like the inertia of stories and how a story can grow from a small seed, like Edward Bernays, saying that cigarettes are torches of liberty, and then it can just build into something that you can't challenge. So if you're one of those women going to this party where you're supposed to wear a green dress because this guy sort of engineered this whole idea that green is in vogue this year, if you go not wearing a green dress, you're a loser. You're a loser, and you're really putting yourself out there, So the stories can just burgeon into this huge thing. So is that what you found as you were going through the process of writing this book?
Yeah, that it exists as a product of policymakers, as a product of ad men, and it also exists almost in a mimetic way, right? That at a certain point, consumer culture is also just its own monster. I don't think anybody wakes up and says, like, I'm going to make North America into soulless consumers this morning, right? But there are all of these incentives to push us this way toward that next purchase, right? And so the end result is there, even if no one person intended that. That said, it is creepy how often it actually is a bunch of guys in a room making these decisions, right?
Totally.
Like one of the stories in the books is about the Phoebus Cartel, which these were like all the people who were like the heads of light bulb companies around the world, and they literally got together because light bulbs worked too well, and decided that they would all agree to have light bulbs die after 100 hours so that they could sell more light bulbs. And anybody in the cartel that started making light bulbs that worked too well, they would get fined by the other members of the cartel, right? So sometimes it actually is that clean and clear.
And then it just becomes a given.
Gross profits, or
It's actually, this is a very strong parallel to my line of work with the fossil fuel industry, right? Like we know now, thanks to some great whistleblowing and document tracing, we know now that the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change. Actually, the fossil fuel industry had the best climate scientists in the world.
They could afford them.
Yeah, they could afford them. Exxon had the world's best climate science, the world's most up-to-date cutting edge models at the time back in the 60s. And so then they saw that there was a clear link between burning fossil fuels and all these ecological tipping points and all this ecological breakdown. And what happened instead of developing, a transition plan, the Petroleum Association, so again, a bunch of guys in a room, who got together and decided to launch a public deception campaign, which took many different forms. So they sunk a bunch of money into misinformation campaigns around debunking the existing climate science, much of which was actually theirs. That's the, like, you know, this is very much like the light bulb thing.
Yeah. And Edward Bernays, like, just sort of
totally.
quick side note, Edward Bernays also like encouraged American Tobacco to create basically anti-science papers, and they would flood newspapers with that that kind of anti-propaganda whenever people started to worry that cigarettes were bad for you.
Exactly. And actually the big oil playbook really was taken from the big tobacco playbook. Like these are sort of like methodologies of creating society-wide stories that have been passed from powerful group of men to powerful group of men.
Right, like here's the playbook, right?
It's literally manual, and they actually have like manuals of how to. So part of what the fossil fuel industry did was fund a bunch of, it's called astroturfing, right? Fund a bunch of climate denial groups, some of which have grown into very powerful associations, climate denial associations, and fund scientists who are willing to sort of speak out against climate change. And then they also invested a lot of money in creating this narrative that climate change is something that we all created together, and that we all need to do our part. And so this message is coming from the fossil fuel war room. It's interesting, there's the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, ran a project called the Corporate Mapping Project. And they mapped fossil fuel messaging across all their social media and across all the groups that they fund. And this is the overarching message that they really lean into, which is climate change was created by all of us. So, you know, you with your demand have helped create this problem. So, you know, when you go to fill up gas and it has the little sticker that says, please use our products responsibly. But it's
no, I find
this, right?
I find that so fascinating. And there's a section in the book that talks about Dixie Cup and Coca-Cola deciding in response to the fact that they had essentially invented single-use beverage containers and single-use like ice cream cups. What they were going to do was start, they basically invented the idea of litter bugs and put it on the consumer, right? And there are instances of this in England, America, and Canada, of putting the onus on the consumer, that it's their job to clean up, and not something that we can do collectively.
Exactly. And so I would love to dig into that tension between individual action and collective action. I mean, it's something that I've focused on a lot in my career, because you and I talked about this, that narrative can be tremendously disempowering for people, because it's basically saying, okay, this massive global issue is happening, you know, there's ecological breakdown happening, and the only tools that you have to fight this is your consumer dollar and your micro lifestyle choices. And
you're
that's gotta
recycling
do something to us.
Yeah. Every time you buy something, you're a bad person. And also, by the way, when you throw a plastic cup in a recycling bin, that's helping, but it doesn't really help. We're reading a lot about that lately, about how recycling is kind of a hoax. It is very disempowering, and I think you're right. It encourages people to begin to think, it's all my fault, and therefore I'm to blame, and I'm not part of the solution, right? And B, because it's my fault, because I'm not part of the solution, I have to just sit back and wait for some other solution to happen, right? For somebody else to fix it, because I'm clearly not going to fix it.
And then it takes the onus through that guilt and shame and apathy. It takes the onus away from collective action, which is really where the power lies.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, this is the thing about voting too, right? Yes, collective action on the street. I think that's part of it. But ultimately, like when we want policy change, we need politicians to be stressed out about a voting public that has demanded change, right? So and this is what excites me about a generation that has been kind of disillusioned, right? Like I was saying at the beginning, this book kind of began with bitterness, and there is a lot of bitterness in younger people that I hear from that, are talking about like not getting what they thought they were supposed to get, right? But if we can move past that, there is also opportunity in that disruption of the dream, right? Because that's what it is. It's that consumer story being exposed as a fairy tale, and you start looking for new ways to measure your life. And if more of us are having that kind of disruption, that waking up, then I think that's the point when politicians start getting a little bit more nervous about not creating policy that's going to work against planned obsolescence and everything else.
I love that hopeful note. And in your book, you call it useful disillusionment. That you're seeing in a younger generation that you felt yourself. And it's almost like this moment of the emperor's not wearing clothes, right? Where you're like, the story that seemed so like, solid ground is actually built on not very much at all. And I'm actually curious, if you can speak a little bit to how the pandemic might have highlighted, might have interacted with some of the ideas in your book, because you were probably at the tail end of writing it, right?
Yeah, no, I was writing this book during the pandemic. Yeah, I was like, the second half of the book was being written in the first half of the pandemic. Yeah. So yeah, the pandemic was a funny thing, I think, for environmentalists, because and I'm curious how you viewed it, because I think at one point, you would read stories which turned out not to be true about how like the dolphins had come back to like parts of the, and like everything was
totally.
The world was reborn, and the skies had cleared. And we know that greenhouse gas emissions are back and beyond where they were before the pandemic, and we're not even done with the pandemic yet. So that was just a speed bump. That was not the radical change that we need. But it was what is called an existence proof. So there's this thing
I love this. Yes.
There's a thing in physics called an existence proof, which is when they can see that something exists, they just don't know how to make it happen. But the fact that it exists is its own proof. And it gives them hope that one day they'll be able to make that thing happen. So for me, that's what the pandemic was. That was an existence proof of radical change. The fact that as difficult as that was, and as damaging to our economies as that was, it pointed out that the whole consumer game really is just one way of life. And there are other ways just like lying underneath the surface of this varnish, right? Just waiting to come up, right? All that sourdough bread we made, right? It was all just like waiting to come out.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I mean, that's literally my job, is to sort of uncover those other ways and organize around them. And part of that is believing that they're possible, which is, I think, something that the pandemic may have exposed for us in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways, it really showed us that like emergency level action from the government is possible. Like we haven't seen that before in our lifetimes, but that's what happened during World War II as well.
It also showed us how when radical change does take place, to a degree, the earth is actually very forgiving. That stuff did start to it was amazing how quickly skies clear, how quickly like things started to shift briefly but quickly, right? So that, I mean, for that reason, like, I don't know how optimistic I am about the future, but I'm certainly hopeful about the future. And like that little glimpse of blue sky gave me a lot of hope.
Oh, I love that. I do want to just sort of like keep us going on this note of hope before we turn to questions, because you're exposing something really big in this book, and you've done a really careful sort of dissection of it. And then, as you mentioned, you turn to three entry points into a different story. Craft, which is sort of getting in there and using our hands and engaging with the physicality of things in a slower way than we're used to in our consumer culture, and the sublime, and care. And we've already talked a little bit about care, but I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you found your way to this idea of the sublime and how that could help change that story for you.
Yeah, well, the sublime, let's see. I was hiking with my husband and sort of like the skirt of a glacier. And we had been talking about like buying a condo and renovations and like all of these like very middle class consumer dramas and anxieties, right? And in doing that, in being kind of overtaken by the natural world, it brushes aside all of those petty. You're not worried about like what wine am I supposed to bring to that party, or what dress am I supposed to wear, or what, right? It has a way of making you, the sublime makes you very small and very large at once, right? It makes insignificant all of the things that consumer culture holds up as the thing by which you measure your life. At the same time, when you give those things up and turn to, for a moment, that kind of that like brain shivering experience of the sublime under the stars, or in the corner of a wave, or on a desert, or wherever, it reminds you that you are maybe not connected to all those consumer things you thought you were connected to, but you are actually connected to something a million times greater, right? That the fact that you can apprehend the sublime means there's this sort of invisible thread between your brain and the mountains and the universe, and a sense of infinity. Like it's a miraculous thing that humans can actually even experience awe, right? So just to have that kind of shivering awareness of our larger world, for one thing, it lifts you up and gives you something to feel excited about in your own life. But also, if we care about the planet on that level, on that like almost holy level, we would be less eager to destroy that planet.
Right. So you've talked about, that's so beautiful, the shivering moment of awe, and it's that moment of looking up when everything around you is sort of telling you to keep looking down. And so how do you create that for yourself in your life? How do we do that when we're, the pandemic has really exposed how burned out people are and how much we're stuck in this sort of.
And I mean, people have asked me about this, because in the chapter I have the luxury of going and in a way consuming the sublime by going to this glacier, right? By seeking it out. It's really important though to remember that like you can experience the sublime by examining a leaf, right? There've been a lot of philosophers and even scientists who have looked at the way that the sublime it is most obviously showing up in those big, Hollywood kind of moments. But the funny thing is that it exists anytime we feel kind of bowled over by the magnificence of the natural world. For some people, it exists in the religious. It doesn't exist there for me, but it does in the natural world. And the natural world is generally, even if you're in a city, it is always available to you in some way, right? It's horrifying the way that, things like light pollution can keep you from seeing the Milky Way and so. But I would challenge anybody to show you any part of the world that doesn't have an opportunity for wonder somewhere hidden inside it.
I love that. it is available to us. I mean, the miracle of existence, or the awe of simply existing, can sort of change our lens on how we view seemingly mundane things around us, like a leaf.
Yeah.
Which is really beautiful. And so taking that sort of sense of there's a different way to live. There's a more humane way to live. There's a more caring way to live. Do you see that? Do you see that shifting for your friends or for your family, or do you see that shifting in our culture right now at all? And where do you see the hope for that?
It's funny. I don't think I don't know whether you have to believe that the change is going to happen, because change is such a certainty in our near future, right? So I'm kind of two minds, right? On the one side, I do see a generation that is disillusioned in this useful way, that is looking for other ways to measure their lives, that is beginning to inhabit new stories about what life is for and what the purpose of their days is. And I think they're going to vote differently than their parents voted. And I think that's going to help a lot. At the same time, I have this other side of my brain that is just saying, young people are often just as consumer driven as older people are.
Yeah.
The difference in their lives may be that they aren't allowed to keep on living in that fantasy, because this change is happening so fast, right? Everything that we enjoy in our civilization is predicated upon a stable climate. And that means 300 parts per million for CO2, right? And just recently, it's like over 400 parts per million, right? We have no idea what kind of instability that is about to bring upon us, right? To think that like 1,000,000 years of climate stability is what finally allowed this little brief miracle of consumer culture in the 20th century to pop up at the end, this kind of insane fantasy of constant happiness and well-being, right? So when I'm feeling more pessimistic, I still think, whether they want to or not, the next generation will be discovering these other stories because they will be forced upon them.
Right. And you sort of illustrate that time scale with this very poetic image of marine snow, like ancient plankton that took pieces of the sun and stored them underwater and gave us these oil reserves that enabled us to exploit and exploit and exploit.
Yeah. And tens of millions of years to produce, and a couple years to gobble it up.
100 years to gobble it up. And so in that sense, we've exhausted this story. And
yes, exactly. Yeah.
And if we can use it up in a couple 100 years, and in the magnitude of time, that's such a tiny blip, then maybe it wasn't that big a story.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like the inheritor of a fortune, right? Who like blows it at the racetracks or something, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, $1 million can quickly turn into not that much money.
Yeah.
I love that. I think we should maybe take some questions from the audience.
Sure.
I'm sure people want to hear from you, but thank you so much for digging into some of those, especially those really beautiful aspects of your book.
Oh, my pleasure.
It was a real journey for me, and like I said, it was a very different kind of climate book that invited different questions. So if people are looking for more of a spiritual deep dive, a personal story, I really encourage you to pick up this book. So the first question sort of takes us back to earlier in the conversation, where we were talking about this assumption of endless growth and GDP being the tool of that. And this person asks, UNDP developed, it's Henry. So Henry asks, UNDP developed the Human Development Index as a measure of national economic, social, and environmental development. What is your take on this versus GDP?
I am not nearly smart enough to answer that question, but I can try. I can say that that yeah, yes, like quality of life indexes, and there are many different proposed alternate indexes. Jorgen Randers, one of the authors of oh gosh, what? Anyway, he spent his lifetime working on this. Um,
Mm,
he has invented a sort of like 5-step index as well.
yeah.
Um, I I love them. I think if we can get more countries like New Zealand that are going to bring those on as like a measure of what success looks like,
Yeah.
that that's all to the good.
Yeah. Just a quick note, I wanted to add something to that, but please do put your questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and they can reach us that way. But a little bit on the Human Development Index, I mean, that has been a pretty popular model, but the fact of the matter is that it was never able to supersede the GDP as the fundamental sort of measure, which is where your story begins, really. Okay, so this question is from Andrea, and it's sort of getting to this idea of how do we reach people with this message, that the story needs to change. So Andrea asks, how do we frame the message, live well with less, so that it reaches people in a way that resonates?
It's an interesting question because I think that when you write a nonfiction book, people often think that you are providing a prescription, and that's never my intention. I write description. So what I mean is that I'm talking about something that appears to me to be hovering in the zeitgeist. I am very wary of telling people how they ought to live, or in summing up, these are the 5 easy steps for getting us out of this mess, right? I subscribe to sort of Tolstoy's idea of history and historical change, which he talks about history as a wave, and the people or the things that we think made the change happen are just these drops of water at the front of that wave. But there is something unconscious and larger than all of us that is propelling that wave, right? And it is a thesis and recapitulation of the era that came before. And so that doesn't mean that we don't each have our part to play. It's just that we're all so much smaller than our collective selves, right? That there's something happening, I think, collectively that is almost inevitable because of what came before. That each historical moment is a reaction to the last historical moment that cannot be denied, and I think that's what the youth movements of today are. I think they are the beginning of a sort of undeniable reaction, and I don't think that a book like mine creates massive change. I think it is reflecting massive change that's already taking place.
Nina Simone said, the role of the artist is to reflect the times.
Yeah.
That's a really beautiful way to say that. We just have time for one more question. So, there's 2 questions here though. All right, well, actually, I don't know if we have time for 2 questions. Well, we'll start with this one, and if it's really quick, we can take the last one. So Mimi asked, in relation to consumer culture, I would love to have Michael address the fact that even in North America and Western Europe, there are significant wealth inequalities. So usually the most unfortunate people don't have the ability to consume ethically, and they're forced to shop at the dollar store, etc. How should we as a society approach this? And this is really interesting because you spoke to this really well when you and I chatted. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I won't be able to do it again, I'm sure. But I'll try and repeat what I said earlier. I mean, I think basically my point was, if you are having trouble putting food on the table or clothes on your child's back, you are not the problem. We do have massive wealth inequality, and taking the consumption habits of the wealthy and cutting it down to 10% or 1% of its current levels, that's more the focus, I think, as opposed to saying that those who are struggling to get by need to make any kind of changes in their buying habits.
I do want to add to that. I mean, it's important to link the inequality to the story.
Yes.
Like, the consumer story has a dark underbelly, and it's the sacrifice that is required to create growth, because growth can't just come out of nowhere. And so the sacrifice is those who don't get to benefit from that story. And so therefore, that's why we sort of like, it was so important to situate who the story is for at the beginning of the talk, because the people who need to change the story are not the same people who were sacrificed in service of that story. So that was a great question. All right, we will end with this question.
Okay.
A very practical one from Kimberly. So what changes to our public education system do you think would be helpful to nurture the ideas of craft, the sublime, and care that you center in your book?
Oh, man.
Great question.
I mean, I come from a family of teachers. Both my brothers teach in the Vancouver school system. I have so much respect for what they do. And, you know, I actually think they do a lot already to bring a little bit of just humanity to the lives of their students. Gosh, it's a really good question, and I'm going to totally flub it. To the reading, was it reading lists? Is that what we were asking?
Changes to the public education system that would foster, you know, those ideas that you speak about in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of private school systems. I guess, you know, if we tried to make things a little bit more equitable in access to education, that would be a start. Certainly, also not insisting on everybody having the same kind of academic outcomes, that abstract academic university experiences are what everybody is good at. Some people are in love with music. Some people are in love with working on motorcycles, and putting or valuing those other ways of contributing, I think, would be something that a lot of our schools could do. So not having like the arts, for example, be some kind of tag on extracurricular sort of element, right?
Totally. Oh my gosh, we could have a whole other talk just about that.
Yeah.
I think we might have to leave it there because we're a little bit over time, but thank you so much, Michael. It was a real pleasure to
thank you. Thank you.
with you.
Thank you both for being here tonight. That was a wonderful conversation, really. Thank you for navigating all the intricacies of the book, but also that dialogue you had about both of your experiences in this topic. So really, thank you for being here. And for the audience, thank you for being here this evening with us. Thank you especially to Henry, Andrea, Mimi, Kimberly for your very thoughtful questions. Here's the book again. I encourage all of you to go buy it from your local bookstore or borrow it from the library, put a hold on it. If you want to watch this event again, or if you want to share it with your friends who missed it, the event is being live streamed to the library's YouTube channel. So 5 minutes after this event, you're going to be able to find it on our YouTube channel. So my colleague Andrew is going to share the link to that in the chat, so you can find that playlist where we put these events. Now, very importantly, we would love it if you gave us feedback about this event. We're a public institution, so our job is to do programs that work for you. So your feedback is super important. So we keep getting better at this. We're going to share a link in the chat as well to a feedback form. It'll take you 1 minute to fill it out, and I promise you it won't go into a black hole of the internet. We actually sit together as a team and we read your comments and we figure out what went well, what we could do better every time. So it's very important that you tell us what you think of our events. Now, if you want to find out about more events like this, we have a bunch of social channels, so you can follow us on every social media and we promote them there, or you can sign up for our newsletter if you love email. So we're going to share the link to our EVPL newsletter as well. And the last thing I'll say is I want to end by telling you briefly about 2 upcoming events. So to celebrate Black History Month, we are hosting a virtual screening of a concert that features 3 young Black Canadian musicians. And that's going to be available via YouTube throughout the whole month of February. And we also have a couple of other Black History Month events coming up throughout the rest of the month, and some that are happening in March and April. So there's a tag on our events listing site that says Black History Month, and you can find out more there. I'm going to share the link to that event right now. There we go. And then tomorrow, we're also hosting a Lunar New Year event where we're going to discuss the secrets of the red envelopes that symbolize good wishes for the new year and are an integral part of the celebration. So if you want to hear about Lunar New Year, join us tomorrow. I'm going to share the link right now to that event as well. And that's it. That's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed your night. Thank you for spending your evening with us.